"You're too fat to wear that." My husband said it laughing, loud enough for half the room to hear, reaching over to tug at the zipper of the dress I'd bought specifically for that party. The one I'd tried on 3 times in our bedroom mirror that afternoon, turning sideways, sucking in a stomach that had felt, for weeks, subtly, mysteriously different than usual. I laughed along with him, the way you laugh at your own humiliation when the alternative is making a scene in front of 40 of his coworkers. A week later, I sat on a paper-covered exam table with my knees pulled up and my hands folded in my lap, and the doctor looked at the small screen beside her, smiled, and said, "Congratulations, you're going to have a baby." My name is Michaela Turner. Everyone calls me Mickey. I'm 33 years old, a graphic designer in Austin, Texas, and until that ultrasound, I thought the cruelest thing that had ever happened to me was a comment about a dress at a party. I want to tell you now, before I tell you anything else, that it wasn't. The dress was just the first thing that finally cracked open enough for me to see everything underneath it clearly. I met my husband, Colton, when I was 26 at a mutual friend's engagement party, the kind of loud, crowded event where you meet 6 new people and remember none of their names except the one you end up going home with. Colton worked in commercial real estate, confident in the specific, practiced way men in that industry often are, quick with a compliment, quicker with a joke, the kind of easy charm that felt, in those early months, like exactly the steady, self-assured energy I'd been missing in the quieter, more anxious men I'd dated before him. Our early relationship moved quickly in the specific way relationships do when both people are eager to believe they've finally found something solid after a string of things that weren't. Colton took me to nice dinners, remembered small details from our first few conversations, texted good morning without fail, and I remember calling Priya after our 4th date, giddy in a way I hadn't been in years, telling her I thought I might have finally found someone who actually paid attention. I didn't yet understand the difference between a man who pays attention because he's genuinely curious about you and a man who pays attention because he's already, quietly, cataloging the things about you he plans to eventually correct. I want to be honest about the early years of our marriage because I don't think this story makes sense without them. Colton wasn't cruel at the beginning, not in any way I recognized as cruelty at the time. He was attentive. He noticed when I changed my hair. He remembered which wine I liked at restaurants we'd only been to once. It took me years to understand that a man noticing those details isn't automatically the same thing as a man who respects you, and that the same close attention that once felt like devotion can, slowly, reshape itself into something closer to surveillance if you're not paying careful enough attention to the shift while it's happening. The comments about my body started small, the way these things usually do, wrapped in enough concern or humor that they were easy to explain away individually, even as they accumulated into something harder to ignore collectively. 2 years into our marriage, after I'd gained maybe 8 or 10 pounds during a particularly stressful stretch at work, Colton started leaving protein bars on my desk without being asked, started suggesting, gently at first, that we try a new gym together, started commenting, at dinner, on portion sizes in a tone he always managed to make sound like care instead of criticism. I told myself for a long time that he was simply invested in my health, the way a good partner is supposed to be invested in the people they love. I want to describe one particular evening, about 3 years into our marriage, because I think it marks the point where I started, quietly, to understand the shape of what was actually happening. We were getting ready for a dinner with his parents, and I'd put on a blue wrap dress I genuinely loved, one that had always made me feel good about myself in the specific, uncomplicated way certain clothes do. Colton looked at me in the mirror, tilted his head slightly, and said, "You sure that's the one you want to wear? Your mother-in-law notices things." I changed into something looser without fully understanding at the time that I just let him talk me out of a dress I loved, using nothing more than the implication that someone else might judge me for it, a technique I'd come to realize much later that let him shape my choices without ever once having to take responsibility for the shaping himself. By the time we'd been married 5 years, the comments had become frequent enough that I'd built an entire, quiet system around avoiding them, skipping desserts in front of him, wearing looser clothing to dinners with his colleagues, apologizing, reflexively, for ordering a second glass of wine. I didn't fully understand, doing all of that I was managing his comfort at the direct expense of my own, the same slow, invisible transfer of energy I imagine happens in 1,000 marriages that never quite reach the point of anyone calling it what it actually is. I want to describe a few more of these moments because I think the accumulation matters more than any single instance. There was the birthday dinner, my 30th, where Colton ordered the tiramisu for the table and then, when it arrived, slid it pointedly toward the center, further from my side than his, joking to the waiter that his wife was watching her figure this year, a sentence I hadn't said, hadn't asked for, and hadn't been given any real opportunity to object to in front of 6 other guests without seeming humorless. There was the beach trip with his college friends, where he suggested, gently, that I might want to bring the one piece instead of the bikini I'd already packed, just to keep things simple, a phrase that meant, I understood even then without fully letting myself name it, easier for him, not for me. Each of these moments, taken alone, felt survivable, even reasonable, the way a single splinter feels manageable until you realize how many you've quietly been carrying around under the same patch of skin. I want to talk about my closest friend, Priya, because she's the person who first said the word out loud that I'd been avoiding for years. We'd known each other since college, and she'd watched, from a careful, patient distance, as I slowly shrank myself around Colton's preferences over the better part of a decade. He doesn't compliment you anymore, she told me once over lunch about 4 years into my marriage. He used to. I remember it. Now he just manages you. There's a difference, Mickey, and I don't think you're letting yourself see it. I didn't fully let myself see it, not that day, and not for a long time after. I want to be honest about that because I think the honesty matters more than pretending I understood the pattern earlier than I actually did. I loved Colton, or believed I did, in the specific, complicated way you can love someone while also, slowly, losing track of who you were before you started organizing your whole life around not disappointing them. The party where everything finally cracked open was held at the home of one of Colton's senior partners, a large, glass-walled house in the hills west of the city, the kind of event where the guest list mattered as much as the food, where every conversation carried the specific, low-grade performance anxiety of people trying to be remembered favorably by the people who could affect their careers. I'd bought a new dress for it 3 weeks earlier, a deep green wrap style that had made me feel, trying it on in the store's fitting room, more like myself than I had in longer than I wanted to admit. I noticed something different about my body in the weeks leading up to that party, though I didn't understand at the time what it actually was. I was more tired than usual, falling asleep some evenings before 9. My stomach felt subtly different, not larger exactly, just changed, in a way I couldn't fully articulate even to myself. I chalked it up to stress, to a demanding project at work, to the particular exhaustion of a body that had spent years quietly absorbing more tension than I'd ever consciously let myself acknowledge. I put the green dress on that evening, standing in front of our bedroom mirror, turning sideways the way I always did by then, checking myself against whatever version of acceptable I'd been carrying around in my head for years. It fit. I remember being genuinely pleased, standing there thinking I looked good, thinking, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, that I might actually enjoy the party instead of simply surviving it. Colton came out of the bathroom, glanced at me, and reached over, without any warning, to tug lightly at the side zipper, the specific, casual cruelty of a man who has done this exact kind of thing so many times he no longer registers it as anything worth pausing over. "You're too fat to wear that," he said, laughing, the same easy, charming laugh I used to find so appealing, now aimed directly at me in the privacy of our own bedroom, though it wouldn't stay private for long. Maybe go with the black one instead. Less, clingy. I want to describe exactly how that moment felt because I think it matters more than what came after. I didn't cry, not yet. I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the specific stillness you feel when a suspicion you've been quietly managing for years finally gets said out loud, plainly, without any of the softening language he usually wrapped it in. I changed dresses anyway, the same reflexive compliance I'd been practicing for years, and we drove to the party mostly in silence, Colton apparently unbothered, scrolling through work emails at every red light. The comment happened again at the party itself, worse the second time because this time there was an audience. I'd stepped into the kitchen to refill my water, and Colton, standing with 3 of his coworkers near the wine, waved me over, laughing, already telling some version of the story from earlier. Ask Mickey, he said as I approached. She almost wore this dress tonight that would have made the seams cry for help. He laughed again, and two of his coworkers laughed with him, the specific, uncomfortable laugh of people who don't quite know whether they're allowed to disagree with their boss's husband, and I stood there, holding my water glass and laughed along too, because the alternative, in that moment, felt like more exposure than I could bear in a room full of strangers who mattered to his career. I remember the specific texture of that laugh leaving my own mouth, hollow and automatic, the same practice sound I'd been making for years whenever a room needed me to seem unbothered faster than I actually was. One of the coworkers, a younger woman I didn't recognize, caught my eye for half a second afterward, something like sympathy flickering across her face before she looked away, back toward her drink, unwilling, like everyone else in that kitchen, to be the one who said anything different out loud. I finished refilling my water and walked back into the main room alone, Colton's laughter still trailing behind me, already moving on to some other story before I'd even made it out of earshot. I didn't say anything on the drive home. Colton, for his part, seemed entirely unaware that anything unusual had happened, humming along to the radio, mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that his boss had seemed impressed with him that night. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the dark highway, feeling something inside me finally, quietly, begin to separate from the version of my life I'd been managing so carefully for the better part of a decade. I made a doctor's appointment the following Tuesday, not because of anything related to Colton, but because the fatigue and the strange, persistent nausea I'd been chalking up to stress for weeks had finally crossed some internal threshold that made me want an actual explanation instead of another excuse. I sat in the waiting room that morning thinking about work deadlines, about whether I needed to reschedule a client call, about almost anything except the possibility that was about to reshape the entire rest of my week. The waiting room was quiet that morning, just me and an older man reading a magazine 2 chairs down, a television mounted in the corner playing a muted morning talk show neither of us was watching. I remember scrolling through emails on my phone, half drafting a response to a client about a logo revision, my mind occupied with everything except my own body, which felt, in retrospect, like exactly the kind of quiet, practiced distance I'd been maintaining for myself for years by then. The doctor, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Ferreira, who'd been seeing me for 6 years by then, ran a quick set of questions, ordered some routine blood work, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that given my symptoms, she wanted to do an ultrasound before I left, just to rule a few things out properly. I lay back on the exam table, only mildly concerned, watching the small screen beside me without really understanding what I was looking at, until Dr. Ferreira went quiet for a moment, adjusted the wand slightly, and smiled. "Congratulations, Mickey," she said. "You're going to have a baby. I'd estimate around 8 weeks along, based on what I'm seeing here." I want to describe exactly how I felt in that moment, because I think it's the part of this story people find hardest to imagine accurately. I didn't feel joy, not purely, and I didn't feel dread either, not purely. I felt, mostly, a strange, disorienting collision of two facts that didn't belong in the same week of my life, that I was carrying a child, and that 6 days earlier, the father of that child had stood in front of a room full of his colleagues and made a joke about how my body looked too large to fit into a dress that had, it turned out, already been quietly, invisibly changing to make room for the exact thing he'd been mocking me for. I didn't tell Colton right away. I want to be honest about that because I think the honesty matters more than the version where I rushed home breathless with the news. I sat in my car in the clinic's parking lot for almost 40 minutes, the engine off, staring at nothing in particular, trying to understand what I actually wanted the rest of this to look like before I let myself drive anywhere at all. I called Priya first, not Colton, sitting in that parking lot with the windows cracked and the Texas heat already pressing in around me. "I'm pregnant," I told her, and then, before she could even finish her first surprised, delighted response, "And I don't know if I want to stay married to the man who's the father." Priya was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her recalibrating, the same careful, deliberate recalibration I'd come to rely on from her over years of friendship. "Okay," she finally said. "Then let's figure out what you actually want, before you tell him anything at all. You don't owe him an immediate announcement just because biology moves faster than emotional clarity does." "I don't even know what I want yet," I admitted. Part of me is furious. Part of me is genuinely happy about the baby, separate from everything else. I don't know how to hold both of those at the same time without one of them canceling the other one out. You don't have to hold them at the same time, Priya said. You're allowed to be happy about the baby and furious at him and still figure out what you want to do about the marriage, all on completely separate timelines. Nobody said those three things have to resolve themselves together on the same schedule just because they happen to arrive in the same week. I sat with that advice for a long time after we hung up, the engine still off, the parking lot slowly emptying around me as other patients finished their own appointments and drove away toward whatever ordinary afternoons were waiting for them. I don't think I fully believed her, that day, that I was allowed to separate those three feelings out from each other. It took me weeks, honestly, to stop expecting myself to arrive at some single, tidy emotional conclusion about all of it at once. I spent the next several days in a strange, quiet limbo, going through the ordinary motions of my life, work meetings, grocery runs, dinner with Colton most evenings, while carrying a secret that felt, increasingly, less like a private joy I was protecting and more like a piece of leverage I hadn't yet decided how to use. I noticed things during those days that I might have overlooked before, small inconsistencies in Colton's schedule, a new habit of stepping onto the back porch to take calls he never used to bother hiding, a specific, careful attentiveness to his phone that reminded me, uncomfortably, of patterns I'd read about but never let myself fully apply to my own marriage. I found the messages 9 days after the ultrasound, not through any deliberate investigation, but because Colton left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a notification slid across the top of the screen from a contact saved simply as K, a message that made the floor of our kitchen feel, for the second time in 2 weeks, like it had tilted several degrees without actually moving at all. I didn't open the full thread. I didn't need to. The preview line alone told me everything I needed to understand about how long Colton had been managing a version of our marriage that had very little to do with the one I thought I was living inside. I remember standing at that counter for several minutes afterward, not moving, listening to the shower running down the hall, feeling something in me sort itself into two entirely separate categories at once. The part of me that wanted to march down that hallway immediately and demand every detail, and the part of me, quieter, more familiar by then, that had spent years learning to gather myself carefully before reacting to anything that might give Colton the chance to reframe it before I'd even finished understanding it myself. The quieter part one. I set the phone back down exactly where I'd found it, screen still facing up, and went to sit at the kitchen table, waiting for him to come out, the same waiting I'd once done years earlier over a different kind of discovery entirely. I called Priya again that same evening, sitting in my car in our own driveway because I couldn't bring myself to have this particular conversation inside the house. There's someone else, I told her. I don't know how long. I don't know who. I just know there's a name saved as a single letter, and the message underneath it wasn't the kind of thing coworkers send each other. Do you want to confront him tonight? Priya asked, or do you want to actually find out what you're dealing with first? I thought about that question longer than I expected to, sitting there in the driveway with the engine ticking as it cooled. I want to find out first, I finally said. I've spent years managing his comfort around things I should have said out loud immediately. I'm not doing that with this too. I want a whole picture before I say a single word. I want to describe the 2 weeks that followed, because I think they matter more than the confrontation itself. I started paying closer attention, the specific, methodical attention I imagine investigators learn to practice, though nobody had ever taught me any of it directly. I noticed the name K again on a restaurant receipt tucked into Colton's jacket pocket, a lunch charge from a place across town from his office, dated for a Tuesday he told me was full of back-to-back client meetings. I noticed a hotel charge on a credit card statement I usually didn't bother reviewing closely, a Friday night 3 weeks earlier, when Colton had told me he was staying late for a closing dinner with a difficult client. I didn't confront him with any of it yet. Instead, I called my cousin Denise, a paralegal who'd spent years working family law cases, and had an instinct for exactly this kind of quiet, methodical documentation. Take photos of everything, she told me, over coffee at a shop 2 neighborhoods from mine, far enough that I didn't have to worry about running into anyone who knew Colton. Receipts, statements, anything with a date and a location that doesn't match what he told you. Don't confront him with a single piece of it until you have the whole picture, because the moment you show your hand, he gets to start managing the story instead of you. Denise had been through something similar herself, years earlier, with her own first husband, and I remember her telling me, that afternoon, that the hardest part hadn't been discovering the affair itself, but discovering how much of her own instincts she'd learned to distrust in the years leading up to it. You probably already knew, on some level, months before you found that message, she said. Most people do. The body usually figures it out before the mind is willing to look directly at it. I just want you to trust yourself enough now to actually follow through, instead of talking yourself back into the version where none of this is really happening. I spent the following 10 days building exactly that picture, quietly, methodically, photographing statements, cross-referencing dates against the calendar Colton kept on our shared family app, noticing, with each new piece, how completely a pattern I'd never once suspected began to take shape once I finally started looking for it directly instead of explaining each individual piece away. There was a rhythm to it. Once I understood what to look for, always a late meeting on the nights his calendar showed, nothing scheduled past 5, always a receipt from the same 3 or 4 restaurants clustered near his office, always a slightly different version of casual distraction in his voice on the drive home from whichever evening had actually been one of those nights. Kay turned out to be Kayla Voss, a junior associate at Colton's firm, 26 years old, someone I'd actually met once, briefly, at a holiday party 18 months earlier, someone who had smiled at me that night, in a way I now understood carried a great deal more history underneath it than I'd had any reason to suspect at the time. I found out over those 10 days that the relationship had been going on for just over a year, almost exactly the length of time I realized with a specific, sinking clarity that Colton's comments about my body had shifted from occasional to near constant. I don't think that timing was a coincidence, and I don't think, looking back, that it needed to be a deliberate strategy for it to still function like one. A man managing his own guilt sometimes finds it easier to convince himself the person he's betraying deserves a little less of his kindness than she used to get, and Colton, I came to understand, had spent a year quietly building exactly that convenient story for himself, one insult at a time. I decided, once Denise and I had assembled everything, exactly how I wanted this to end, and I want to be honest that the decision surprised even me, given how quiet and accommodating I'd spent years learning to be inside my own marriage. Colton's firm was hosting its annual holiday gala the following month, the same kind of event where the party dress comment had happened a year and a half earlier, the same room full of colleagues and partners whose opinions Colton had spent our entire marriage teaching me, indirectly, to fear more than my own. I told Priya my plan 2 weeks before the gala, sitting at her kitchen table with Denise's folder of documentation spread out between us. I'm not doing anything dramatic in front of strangers, I said. I'm not going to scream, or throw a drink, or give anyone at that party a story to tell for the next 5 years. I just want Colton to understand, in the same room where he humiliated me over a dress, that I know exactly what he's been doing, and that I'm not the only person in that marriage who's been quietly managing a secret. I didn't tell Colton about the pregnancy, or the affair before the gala. I want to be clear about that because I think the timing matters. I let him believe, for those 2 weeks, that everything between us was exactly as ordinary as it had been for years, the same careful, patient performance he'd taught me, unknowingly, to give so convincingly. The night of the gala, I wore the green dress, the same one from the party a year and a half earlier, the one that fit differently now, in the early, barely visible way a body starts changing in its second trimester. Colton noticed, glancing at me as we got ready, something flickering across his face that might have been surprise or might have simply been the specific unease of a man who has spent a year building a private life he assumed nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. I remember standing in front of the same bedroom mirror where he'd once tugged at a zipper and laughed, fastening the same dress myself this time, steady-handed in a way I hadn't expected to feel given everything I was carrying into that evening. I didn't ask him how I looked. I hadn't asked him that question in weeks, I realized, standing there, and I hadn't particularly missed asking it either. We arrived at the same glass-walled house as before, the same crowd, the same low hum of performed professional warmth, string lights strung along the pool deck the same way they'd been 18 months earlier, a bartender in the same corner mixing the same overpriced cocktails for people trying to be remembered favorably by whoever might one day sign their next promotion. I moved through the first 20 minutes on autopilot, nodding at familiar faces. Accepting a glass of sparkling water, I had no intention of trading for anything stronger, watching Colton work the room the way he always did, easy, practiced, entirely unaware that the ground under his own evening had already started to shift. I found Kayla within the first 20 minutes, standing near the same kitchen island where Colton had once made his joke about Seams crying for help, and I walked over, calm, deliberate. The folder Denise had helped me assemble tucked discreetly into my clutch, not to be produced dramatically, but simply because I wanted the weight of it near me while I said what I'd come to say. "Kayla," I said, keeping my voice low, pleasant, the specific, controlled pleasantness of someone who has rehearsed this exact moment more times than she'd like to admit. "I know about you and Colton. I have receipts from the Fig and Olive from March, a hotel charge from the Driscoll in April, and about 4 months of message previews I never needed to open the full thread to understand. I'm not here to make a scene. I just wanted you to know before tonight ends that I know, and that I'm 8 weeks further along in a pregnancy neither of us discussed with you yet." Kayla's face went through several rapid changes, confusion, then dawning horror, then something close to genuine fear, glancing past me toward Colton, who was making his way over, drawn by whatever shift in his periphery had told him this conversation wasn't the ordinary one it should have been. I watched her hand tighten around the stem of her wine glass, watched her take one small step back from me without seeming to fully realize she'd moved at all, the specific instinctive retreat of someone who understands, in real time, that whatever story she'd been telling herself about her own role in this had just become considerably harder to keep believing. "Mickey," he said, arriving beside us, his voice already dropping into the low, placating tone he used whenever he sensed a situation slipping outside his control. "What's going on?" "I was just telling Kayla," I said, turning to face him directly, "that I'm pregnant. 8 weeks, as of a doctor's visit 6 days after you told a room full of your coworkers that I was too fat to fit into a dress that was already making room for your child." I let that sentence sit in the air between the three of us for a moment before continuing. I also mentioned the Fig and Olive receipt and the Driscoll charge and about 4 months of messages that I've decided not to spend any more of my time reading in full because I've already seen everything I actually need to see. The color left Colton's face the way I imagine it leaves most people's faces in the exact moment they understand, completely, that the story they've been managing has run out of room to keep managing itself. He didn't deny anything. Not there, not with Kayla standing frozen beside him and 3 of his colleagues beginning to notice, from a polite distance, that something had shifted in the room's temperature. "Can we talk about this somewhere private?" he said, his voice tight, urgent. "No," I said, and I remember how calm my own voice sounded, calmer than I expected, calmer than I think I'd ever managed to sound in 9 years of carefully avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation. "I've spent years talking to you privately about things that mattered to me and watching you decide, privately, how much of it was worth taking seriously. I'm done having the important conversations of my life happen only where it's convenient for your comfort. You can process this however you need to. I'm going to go enjoy the rest of my evening, because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I don't actually feel like I need your permission to." I didn't stay much longer after that, not out of any dramatic exit, just a quiet, deliberate decision to leave on my own terms instead of waiting to see how the rest of the room would react. I called a car, went home, and slept better that night than I had in months, the specific, unburdened sleep of someone who has finally stopped carrying a weight she didn't realize, until it was gone, had been slowly bending her entire posture for years. The following months moved faster than I expected them to, once the truth was fully out in the open instead of carefully managed between the two of us. I filed for divorce 3 weeks after the gala, working with an attorney Denise recommended, a sharp, unhurried woman named Faith Okonkwo, who helped me structure a custody and support arrangement that protected both my financial stability and the child I was carrying, without requiring me to spend a single additional year performing a marriage that had already, quietly, ended long before either of us said the word divorce out loud. Faith walked me through the process with the same calm, methodical patience Denise had shown me weeks earlier, explaining, in our first meeting, that pregnancy adds a layer of legal complexity most divorces don't have to account for, custody frameworks that technically can't be finalized until after birth, financial support obligations that shift depending on circumstances no court can fully predict months in advance. We'll build this in stages, she told me. First the separation of assets, then a temporary support arrangement, then we revisit everything properly once the baby actually arrives. I know that's not the tidy, single conversation you probably wanted. Divorces involving a pregnancy rarely are. I didn't mind the staged process nearly as much as I expected to. There was something almost steadying about it. I found having a clear, structured sequence of steps to move through instead of the single, dramatic reckoning I might have imagined years earlier, when I still thought endings had to look like the ones in movies to actually count as real. Colton tried, over those months, to rebuild some version of the narrative that would let him remain sympathetic, mentioning, to mutual friends, that I'd humiliated him in front of his colleagues, that I'd overreacted to what he described as an innocent workplace friendship. I let those versions circulate without much response, because I understood by then that I no longer needed every person in our shared social circle to fully understand my side of things in order to know, myself, exactly what had happened and exactly why I'd finally stopped absorbing it quietly. There was one dinner, about 2 months into the process, where a mutual friend, Talia, called me directly, having heard Colton's version secondhand through his sister. "He's telling people you set the whole thing up to embarrass him," she said, her voice careful, clearly unsure how to navigate a conversation she hadn't expected to be having. "I didn't want to just believe it without asking you myself. I didn't set anything up," I told her. "I found out the truth, and I decided to say it out loud in the same room where he'd once decided to humiliate me out loud. Those aren't the same thing, even if he's more comfortable calling them the same thing now." Talia was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she finally said. "I just needed to hear it from you directly." I appreciated that more than I let on, the small, ordinary decency of one person deciding not to simply accept the more convenient version of events without checking first. My daughter, Wren, was born the following June, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a set of lungs that made the entire delivery room laugh despite how exhausted everyone in it was by then. I remember holding her for the first time, feeling something settle into place that I hadn't fully felt settled in years, a specific, uncomplicated certainty that whatever came next, I was going to build it around honesty instead of careful, quiet management. I think about that green dress sometimes, hanging now in the back of my closet, worn once to a party where my husband mocked my body in front of strangers, and once again, months later, to the same room, where I finally stopped letting anyone else decide what I was allowed to know about my own life. I don't wear it often. I don't need to. But I've kept it the same way you keep certain things that mark the exact place where something in you finally, permanently changed shape. I've thought a great deal, since then, about how long it took me to trust the discomfort I'd been carrying quietly for years before I let myself act on any of it. I don't think that slowness makes me foolish, though I spent a long time, in the early months after the divorce, wondering if it did. I think, instead, it's simply what happens to a person who spends nearly a decade being told, in small, deniable increments, that her own instincts aren't quite reliable enough to trust on their own. It takes time to unlearn that, even once you've found the proof that your instincts were right all along. I'm still unlearning some of it now, honestly catching myself, occasionally apologizing for taking up space in a room before I remember I don't need to anymore. Priya still asks me, sometimes, whether I regret not confronting Colton the moment I found those first messages, instead of spending 2 careful weeks building the fullest possible picture before I said a single word. I don't. I think there's a version of myself who might have confronted him immediately, out of pure, understandable anger, and gotten a smaller, more manageable version of the truth in return, the version he would have been quickest to construct under pressure. I wanted the whole shape of it instead, and I think looking back, that patience is the only reason I walked away from that marriage with anything close to the clarity I actually needed to build what came after it. Denise and I have grown closer since all of this happened, in the specific way you grow close to someone who helped you through the exact hardest stretch of your life. She came to the hospital the day Wren was born, sat with me for hours while Priya ran home to grab the bag I'd forgotten to pack properly, and I remember telling her, holding my daughter for the first time, that I didn't think I would have made it through the 2 weeks of quiet documentation without her steady, practical presence guiding each step. She just shrugged, the way she always does when she's uncomfortable with being thanked directly. "You did the actual work," she said. "I just told you where to look." Ren is 8 months old now, and Colton sees her every other weekend, careful, correct, distant in the specific way I imagine most people are when they've had to rebuild an entire understanding of themselves around a story they didn't choose to have told about them. I don't know if he's changed, and I've stopped needing to know. My daughter deserves a father who shows up, and I've decided that's the only measure I'm willing to keep score of anymore. I started dating again about 3 months ago, slowly, carefully, mostly just enjoying the strange, unfamiliar experience of being with someone who compliments a dress without also, somewhere underneath it, managing an opinion about my body he's decided not to say out loud yet. It's a small thing, maybe, to someone who's never had to relearn it. To me, it still feels like something worth noticing every single time it happens. If any part of this sounds like a pattern you've caught yourself managing quietly in your own life, I hope you trust the discomfort a little sooner than I let myself trust mine. Let me know down in the comments where in the world you're catching this story tonight. I love seeing exactly how far these things travel. And if you made it all the way to the end of this one, go ahead and follow along for whatever comes next, because there's always another story waiting its turn.